All right, me. It is the day after Labor Day. It is the 26th, and I'm doing this in a weird order, but I have finished the first of 4 books for War and Peace. I'm currently, for these last couple days, filling in for a teacher that's up on maternity leave. That's what I've been doing for the past couple weeks. And so my substitute teaching time that I would normally spend reading has not been spent reading for the most part. It's been actually teaching, but they're in finals now, and so I don't have time to read. This is gonna feel very weird because War and Peace of itself, right, is comprised of 4 books, right, within the modern way it's written. Leo Tolstoy initially wrote it as 6 books, which then were, I believe, in the second edition, then changed to 4 books and consolidated a little bit. So really this is a massive series, but at the same time it all coalesces into being part of the one long idea of War and Peace. And so you get things like this of where it's 1,500 pages, but it's really 4 books. So that's that. So what I'll end up doing, because it is taking me so long to read, and because it is also such a dense piece of literature, I will be filming at the end of every single book, and then collecting all of those into one major piece, right? So that's that. But book 1 itself, book 1, it has 2 parts to it. There's part 1 in which you are dealing with you're in 1805. Napoleon is starting to push towards the Russians, and you are experiencing the Russian oligarchy and Russian princes and princesses and having this discussion about what is actually going on, and how to move forward as a country of Russia, right? And it is all about the social game. It reads incredibly similar to any Jane Austen piece, of where it is so much about this conversation about this social hierarchy and about the diplomacy and the manners and the how do you treat and how do you act accordingly within and around certain people, right? And so that's like the vast majority of the first book. And it's like all of my previous thoughts with Jane Austen pieces, is that it does just drag, partially because it is just so much conversation, but it's also just so much of like this, you need to have an understanding of who or what or even why these conversations are happening in the way that they're happening, right? So that's like the huge chunk of the first book, or the first part of the first book. What also becomes very tiring is the fact that there is just so many characters, and because it is a Russian piece and Leo Tolstoy is writing, and this is a translated piece, right? What you're also looking at is this huge issue of just how many different names people have, and that becomes this massive thing of like, not only are you meeting 40 characters or whatever, or having to keep track of 40 characters, right? You're also dealing with the fact that each of them have like 3 to 4 names that they might be referred to as, and some of them are not necessarily the most intuitive, and yeah, it's just one of those things where it's like, oh, this is this is so much, and so much is happening, and I'm just tired. But yeah, that is a good chunk of the first part of the first book. We then go on to the second part, which is then some of the men, but not all of the men that have been introduced, are now fighting in the war. And it is still 1805, or maybe approaching 1806. But we are really, the first book ends with the Battle of Austerlitz, and which I think is 1805. But it's this the massive thing of, now we go from this massive description on how of social hierarchy and diplomacy and manners, and then we move into and decorum, and then we just move into, here are pages and pages and pages of descriptions of war movements and how this affects things, and all this stuff, right? And it's another just kind of slog, because then you get introduced to another 20 characters that all have multiple names, but then your connection is through like it's 3 characters, I think off the top of my head, right? It's Rostov, it is Prince Andrei, and it is Boris, and Boris is in there very little, so mostly you're following through Prince Andrei and through Rostov, but also you're following through some other characters, and it's other characters that were like tangentially mentioned in the first part, and it's just a massive just slog, and it's certainly not the most enjoyable thing I've ever read up to this point in my life. It is still very interesting, right? You're dealing with a lot of this, right? I mean, this is written 1870, 1869, 1870, when this was published, I think. And so you're dealing with this thing of like, Russia is about to have this revolution, and there's this huge issue with the way that they have been dealing with money and dealing with things, and now you're having this very huge argument between the aristocracy and people that are kind of on the outside of the aristocracy but have some tangential relations to it, like Pierre, who I assume is going to have a much larger part to play later on and throughout these books. But just this massive issue of like, how does one fight for one's country, and how does one uphold one's country when there's nothing to uphold, right? Or what you are protecting is very little, right? And so like, this comes up with Pierre and Pierre and Prince Andrei and their love of Napoleon, because right, from an outside perspective, Napoleon's whole argument is based around the overconsumption of the elite, and to attempt to give as much power back to the people as possible. Of course, that is not what actually happens, but right, that is part of the massive amount of revolution that occurs at that point in time. And so like, you have people like Pierre, who is an illegitimate son, and like is portrayed as like he's all about it. He's all about Napoleon. He is on Napoleon's side, and then all of a sudden, his father, who is a count, decides that he is going to give basically all of the estate to Pierre, and Pierre is now going to inherit a whole bunch of money. And then all of a sudden Pierre is like, whoa, hold on now. And there's the shift in Pierre of being this very, very outspoken, very brash, individual to like immediately adopting what is supposed to be or what is expected of him in the role of being a count. And so like you have some conversation there, and you have just some discussion there. You have like, you know, Prince Andre, who is also loves Napoleon from a militaristic standpoint, and then Andre ends up basically seeing the fall of the fall of the Russians at Austerlitz, and their destruction and them falling apart, and then gets captured and actually gets to meet Napoleon while he's captured. And what he ends up realizing is this concept or idea of like that what they're fighting for is inherently very, very small. And it generally, I think it kind of gets displayed as like Leo Tolstoy's belief in that the reason why the Russians struggled against Napoleon early on in this war was because that the Russians were fighting for things that were not necessarily important, right? Which is a whole lot of what part 2 of book 1 goes into, is that the Russians are fighting for purely for glory, or purely, right? They're fighting for their own individual accomplishments, right? This comes up at one point of where like they need to send like 3 men to go scout something, and instead the commander or general sends the entire regiment, and so sends, you know, a couple hundred people or whatever to go do this thing. And it's like he gets asked of why would you do this? This makes no sense. Why would you send the entire regiment to go do this? And the response from the general is basically, look, they will all go get to say that they fought in this battle, and then most of them will return home and they will be honored and they will receive medals, and then the world will move on, right? And so what they're constantly fighting for honor, not honor, but for glory, but for personal gain, right? And then, you know, there's all the celebration of like, oh yes, they've, you know, fought and 2 people were killed, or 1 person was killed, or 3 people were killed, and it's glorious and it's wonderful. And then Austerlitz happens, and everything falls apart, and so many people are dying, and all of a sudden it's this realization that, oh, war is a real thing. War isn't just something we get to play and pretend and make believe. People are actually dying here, and a lot of people are dying. So yeah, you know, there's quite a bit of commentary on that. Yeah. I'm trying to think, is there anything else to really discuss here right now? I think not. I think that's kind of it as of right now through book 1, and then through like the first like 2 chapters in book 2. Yeah, you know, one of the hard parts about this book is that it's not a novel, right? And this is something that Leo Tolstoy was very, very specific on, is that it is not a European novel as, you know, you or I or anyone else would really understand, even though it generally gets classified as a novel. It is this weird combination of fiction and novel, but also this retelling and history book of the way that the war and the changes in Russia happen, right? And it is this, it is an exploration of what does it mean to be Russian, I guess, or like the history of how we get to 1870, right? And it's just not quite a novel, right? It is some weird amalgamation of a number of different types of book. right? Because a huge part of it also is that so much of a huge number of the characters are based on or are real people, or are very significantly based on real people, right? And that is something that is always interesting when it comes to dealing with characters and things, of how do you actually quantify that, and how much of this is truth and fiction, and how much truth does a thing need to have to be considered historical record. Yeah, I think that's it. I think I've talked way too much about the first book of War and Peace up to this point. Hopefully this will go smoother in the near future. All right, me. It is, I believe it's June 2nd. It could be the 3rd, but it's sometime in early June. And this morning I finally finished reading the second book of War and Peace. Second volume, second book, whichever we prefer to call it. This took me a long time to read. I read most of it while finishing out some substitute teaching, which was like effectively me holding study halls while they were taking finals. But I was still doing a whole bunch of stuff, and so like that wasn't as reading productive as it normally would have been. And then, but yeah, part of it is that just looking at the mountain of the book makes me not as interested as I should be, because I am entirely fascinated by the piece, and yet it is every time going to it is like staring into the abyss, right? Especially because because of how I read these first two books, in which during substitute teaching, over a long period of time, I'm not fully grasping or connecting things the way that I probably should be, which makes this a little bit harder, but that's that. Book 2 definitely focuses much more on the peace side of War and Peace, and I think that this is the way that's going to go. I assume book 3 is going to be a lot about war, which I'll talk about more in a second, and I assume book 4 is going to be a lot more about peace than afterwards. But this entire book this entire volume was much more focused on the peace side of War and Peace. It also spans a lot larger frame, right? Volume 1 ends in 1806 or 1807, right? Either it ends in late 1806 or early 1807, when basically all of our main young male characters leave the front lines of the war. Treaties have been signed, and then move back to Russia, to inland Russia. But then this volume spans unfortunately 6 or 7 years, because they go to like this ends at the end of 1811. This ends in the winter of 1811, and so it's just this weird kind of the first book basically takes place over the span of 9 months, and this one is over the span of 6 years, which is very, very strange in that sense. But yeah. Lots of discussion about marriage and about how do these relationships actually work out, right? You have Nikolai Rostov, who comes back from the war, brings Dolokhov and brings Denisov back to his house. And then you get this whole thing in which Denisov, who I believe is probably out of the entire picture of the book at this point, but Denisov proposes to Natasha. Natasha's 13 or 14 at this point, maybe 15. But he proposes to her, and she turns him down, and Denisov realizes that he has completely made a fool of himself. What is a shame, because I like Denisov. But then presumably, I think it gets described that he goes back to the front lines immediately and like stays there. You then have Dolokhov, who proposes to Sonia, but Sonia turns him down because Sonia is still waiting to marry Nikolai Rostov. Now this becomes an issue because Dolokhov eventually knows Rostov and Dolokhov play cards. Dolokhov sets Rostov, Nikolai, $43,000 or 43,000 rubles in debt, which is, 3 years' salaries, something like that. I think it actually be 4 years, because I think it's described that Nikolai gets like a $10,000 or 10,000 ruble yearly payment from his parents. And so it's like, yeah, this is, 4 years of debt that you've now built, because Rostov, or because Dolokhov is this person who right, as a character, it is a character that is this vindictive but also womanizing character, and that's basically all Dolokhov does, and that's the vast majority of the description of Dolokhov. At the same time, Dolokhov is taking care of his mother and his sister who can't work, and eventually tries to help Anatol to also do something that is incorrect, but it does it out of pure loyalty out of his friend, right? And so you have this whole thing in which Dolokhov is both incredibly loyal, but is also incredibly vindictive as soon as he feels that loyalty is not intact, right? But basically this entire thing, right, sets into motion the entire downfall, what I think is going to be the entire downfall of the Rostov family, right? Because it's like, I can't remember if Rostov and Dolokhov knew each other before the war, if they met in the war, but I feel like that is like that will become kind of one of these major themes throughout this entire piece, is like this, how the interests of a country end up affecting the people that live in it, right? Because what has now occurred is this whole scenario in which the Rostov family has money and it has lordships, but is also bumbling them away constantly because of the older count, Nikolai's father. So there's not really any money actually in the family, and so someone needs to marry rich. And what it becomes is that, or right, in theory, like, they should all be fine and they should all be comfortable. But what was actually happening now is that because there's this bubbling away of money from both the Count and from Nikolai, right, now someone has to marry rich, or marry into a family that has money, right? Which wasn't a problem to begin with, because if they had money, Rostov and Sonia could have been married, and that would have been fine, because as described, Sonia is this woman who is, if it weren't for the fact that she was orphaned and then brought up in the Rostov family, would be a perfect marriage for anyone. But because she is doweryless, right, it is something that someone is choosing to do instead of seeing marriage as a tool for something, right? But you have Natasha, who turns down a wealthy person because there's no need for her to marry at that point. But then also you end up in the situation in which Sonia turns down Dolokhov, who is also in some way a wealthy person or has connections, because she's anticipating to marry Rostov. But now Rostov owes 4 years worth of salary to Dolokhov, and so now everything is falling apart. This entire Rostov family is falling apart, which then leads to theirs are testing because it's a Tuesday, which then leads into this very, very weird, complicated relationship in which Rostov and Sonia still want to marry, but they can't because there's no money for them, so that they're going to have to, I assume they're going to have to marry other people, and Natasha will have to marry someone rich, which then comes into play later, in which you have Prince Andrei back into the scene, and you have Pierre back into the scene. Prince Andrei, after recovering from his wounds, comes back, meets Natasha at her first ball when she's 14 or 15, falls in love with her, chooses that he's going to marry her because of this new financial situation. They agree to it, that Natasha will be married, which then brings out this whole long and drawn out process. But then Prince Andrei, before he actually does marry Natasha, leaves back for the war again. We don't really hear from him again. But then we continue to follow Natasha as she is turning 15 and 16, and getting older, and her dealing with this fact of that she is betrothed and she wants to be married, but she is also under this constant feeling that her entire life is falling apart because the person that she is betrothed to is not writing to her at all and is not communicating with her at all. And so it becomes this push and pull of emptiness and loneliness, but also what is best for the family. It then all falls apart because of Pierre, in a very strange way. Prince Andrei is supposed to come back at some point in 1811 at this point, because we've skipped so many years. He's supposed to come back. They go up to St. Petersburg. They meet Pierre's wife. Pierre also gets married at this point, because Pierre has gone from being this Napoleon-loving, very, very fiery, very brash, very outspoken guy to being the most eligible bachelor in Russia, because he suddenly has all this money, and he's just kind of become a dude and just some guy. Right, he's just become part of the bourgeois, and he ends up marrying a woman in Helena, also referred to as Ellen, who is this very, very lovely, but also incredibly independent woman. There are lots of rumors about her having affairs constantly, but then also this potential affair that is heavily implied, that she is having an incestuous affair with her brother Anatole, which then all comes back around, in which when they hear Prince Andrei is coming back, the Rostovs go up to see Pierre, because Pierre is kind of like this liaison between Prince Andrei and the Rostov family. They meet Ellen. Ellen then takes Natasha, who's this very impressionable girl, under her wing, and it devolves into this hyper independence in a way, but also this whole issue of, what does it mean to have responsibility to other people and to yourself, right? And this idea of, like, love and enjoyment, and what is marriage actually supposed to do, right? Where the Natasha's marriage and presumably Nikolai's marriage is supposed to eventually be for marriage is supposed to be used as a tool rather than for love, which then really frustrates this whole thing of, right, they're being told one thing in which they have to marry these people, but then also being told constantly, oh, but it's your choice, oh, but do you love this person, right? Which puts everyone into this very strict, confined space, right? Especially someone like Natasha, who is this incredibly young, incredibly impressionable girl who basically got to do one social outing and then was married off, right? And you know, instead of being allowed to figure things out and truly understand what she wants, right, is now having to figure it out while also having these responsibilities for other people. And it all falls apart, and everything falls apart. Anatole tries to elope with Natasha, but it all falls apart. Partially because Anatole's actually already married to a Polish girl that he was supposedly forced to marry, although that account is untrustworthy. They break off the engagement between Prince Andrei and Natasha, but then Pierre realizes that he actually does love Natasha, which I assume is where all this is going to go at the end of this, is that this Natasha and Pierre is going to be this kind of spiritual awakening kind of deal, which is great, and that's lovely. Sonya's going to get screwed out of all this, I can already tell. Sonya's going to get... Who is Sonya, who is probably the best character in all of this, the most likable character, I should say, right, is going to be the one that is going to just kind of fall through the cracks, because it doesn't matter how great she is doweryless, right? And there is no money, there's no, in marriage to her, there is no gaining in the society, right? In a society that is obsessed with movement and social status and the respect between, or implied respect between, other people, right? Someone like Sonya, who, despite having all the talents, all the gifts, all the attractiveness, is just going to get left behind because she doesn't have any financial backing, right? Which is a shame. It really is. God, yeah, it's just a lot of marriage stuff, right? And that was basically me spending 14 minutes summarizing the plot of this book, or this volume. The interesting thing, at least the one I could think to really talk, two things I should say, is number one, you have Pierre's descent into Freemasonry and the joining of the Freemasons and all this stuff, right? And it's a lot about this whole spiritual awakening and, like, how do you be ethical and how do you be the best person you can be in a world that is inherently unethical or inherently distrustful, which is an important question, right? Because it is, I think, is a question that Tolstoy struggled with a lot in a lot of ways. But it really is just this question of, like, you know, we are living in a world that wants to promote morals and promote values, right? And yet, as soon as we don't have to worry about them, we throw them to the wayside, right? And that's exactly what Pierre has done already, right? Pierre was so focused on this idea of the people and power to the people, and it immediately falls apart as soon as he is given money because the count dies, right? And so, you know, that's a huge spiritual journey that's going on there. The other thing to talk about that I think found somewhat interesting was the hunting scene that occurred at one point. I don't remember who's all in. I think it's all the Rostovs, I think. And you have this thing with the Rostovs and with their neighbor and the dogs. And, you know, there's certainly some symbolism within the dogs, right? Of this whole idea of the you know, the old scrappy dog versus the clean and finished and polished dog. You have all that stuff, right? But then you also have this whole idea of, like, you know, basically using the dogs in the same way that the men were being used in warfare, of just seeing them as packs of creatures to get danger to move in a very specific way, and not necessarily caring all that much about what happens to the dogs or what happens to the people from the commander's perspective, right? Which was very, very fascinating thing. But at the same time, viewing the success of the animal or the success of the troop as the success and the training of the master or of the commander, not the success of the dog or success of the troop, right? Which is this very complicated thing about, like, hierarchy and ownership, and, you know, how do we view soldiers in wartime effectively, right? And all of these things, right? So, God, that's volume 2 of War and Peace. You know, maybe I'll finish this before I move. Maybe I'll finish it right as I move. Who knows? But that's that. All right, me. It is. I don't remember what day it is. I move in 36 hours. I know that much. It's sometime in June. I finally finished reading War and Peace, book 3 out of 4. We're almost there. My cover is about to fall off. God, this book within War and Peace, the 3rd book, definitely took the longest out of all of them, partially because of moving and getting those things prepped. But then a lot of it just has to do with the fact that, like, it is so much of this book centers around the Battle of Borodin, which in of itself is important within the larger story of the Russian-Franco conflict, and Napoleon, and then the eventual defeat of Napoleon through attempting to continue and campaign in Russia in the winter, right? But it is because it is so focused on so much. So much of the description is war-based and tactical maneuvers and things. It was just a drag to get through. Once we got out of the lead up to the battle, then it was fine. But definitely the lead up in this section was just chugging along. Especially in part 2. I think part 2 was the worst in that. But yeah. Once again, this book takes like 2 months maybe, because we end at the beginning of September, and I think we started in like July, and so like it's like a 2-month book. But so much happens, right? Because you have the war stuff, but then you also have this kind of breakdown of what does war mean, and the realizations and the religious experience that gets pushed by or ends up being felt by our really three main characters throughout, right? In Nastasia, Prince Andre, and Pierre, where all three of them have this sort of very religious movement at various points, either because of the war itself or because of, in Nastasia's case, this recollecting, or this idea that is what has gotten her through after her failed engagement and her presumed infidelity, but you know, the wanting to run away with Anatole and things that occurred in book 2. In book 3, she very much turns to religion, and then it's not as described once we go back to her later in book 3, but presumably she's still this very religious person that kind of comes about during all that. So that's all that. Yeah. A lot of this book also takes place from the viewpoint of Napoleon, which also drags throughout the story. It's a very interesting beat of storytelling in providing this new character at this point within the books that is this incredibly important person, and really the person that like everything in these books has actually revolved around, or like has instigated all of the actions in some way. But so much of it is tactical stuff, and so much of it is like this, more or less the conversation of war, which is not, from Napoleon's perspective, is not the most interesting, right? What becomes much more interesting, and really what kind of blends this thing together, is that there are parts that I assume are supposed to be from Napoleon's point of view, but are very much just kind of like Leo Tolstoy writing kind of his own personal thoughts on the way the world works, right? And so there's a lot of what really becomes interesting throughout this this specific book is all of the conversations that occur around what is war used for, what is war good for, right? And you start off with this whole idea of from, is it Prince Andre that says it, or is it Boris? Someone says it, I don't remember who. Someone says it to Pierre, I believe. But the idea that, you know, within, I think it's Prince Andre, that if he was to be put in charge of all war, he would never take any prisoners, and he would pillage all villages and destroy all villages, and presumably not let civilians survive, right? And his argument for that is then that, you know, if that's the case, and that is the way that war becomes run, then there's no reason to ever have war unless it actually means something, right? The belief in story that gets told throughout the book is that this second war, Franco-Russian War in 1811, 1812, comes about because there's like a tenuous peace after like the 1805 stuff, and then there's like some small slight to someone that is an officer of Napoleon against someone who is an officer that is Russian, and that sparks this next major war that causes so much death and destruction. And there becomes a lot of these conversations about, what is war actually good for, and a lot of the conversation then becomes centered around this whole idea of war is not being used for the right things, right? War is instead being used to settle petty disputes that do not matter, or to improve the rank, or to make someone look better than they are, right? And that definitely becomes something that gets talked about quite a bit, right? It certainly gets explored a lot through Boris, right? Boris is definitely this main contributor of, like, we get to see Boris somehow go from being this kind of just average, I should say average, but this kind of run-of-the-mill elite in some way, to then just constantly rising up these ranks and constantly having more power, even though there's no reason for him to have more power, and more grandeur and more recognition of things, right? That so much of war and the way that war happens is so that someone can look like they are the genius and be paraded around and have recognition, right? And Leo Tolstoy in these sections is really against that. That's completely correct, Leo Tolstoy, because it is so much of this, and the way that the battles get moved, and this whole idea that, like, war is a game of chess, it comes down to this whole idea that commanders and officers, as discussed within book 2 of this whole metaphor that gets played out with the dogs, is that officers and commanders and things get a lot of recognition, and a lot of the recognition and I guess recognition is just the right word I'm looking for commendment, I guess, for simply being the person that happened to be in control when good things happen to them, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it was the best thing or the right thing. It was just the thing that happened, right? So there's a lot of discussion about that. You then have, God, what else is there a lot of discussion of? There's a great deal of discussion around the inevitability of things, right? Of that, what is done, and that much in the same way of this whole commanders and officers thing, is that we should not be recognizing a singular person and completely accepting a singular person or singular idea for moving things forward or getting the better of something, right? And instead it is this inevitability of fate, right? Of that, there's this rolling stone of history and of the world and sociopolitical stances, and how all of this kind of works together, that creates this rolling stone effect of it is inevitable, and things are just going to keep on moving no matter who is there. And that definitely gets talked about a lot in these sections, of that, going back to the main focus of this, which is the Battle of Borodin, right? The Battle of Borodin becomes important because it is, in theory, the first time that Napoleon faces what is it, really a victory or a draw, but is a moral loss to the French, right? And even though he comes out on top, and he, part of it is that he is claimed to be be sick during the day of battle, and so it's like, you know, the Russians should be celebrating the, you know, adjutant that forgot Napoleon's wet boots, you know, 2 days beforehand. They should be erecting statues and giving medals to that person, because if it is, you know, if the only thing that we care about and the only thing that we are interested in is one specific person in Napoleon, then yeah, you know, we should be giving statues to people that indirectly stop Napoleon, right? Or we can see it as, you know, this is just how this battle was going to work out. Of, you have people defending their homeland and like really defending what is the road to Moscow, and how do you do that in this plane with a weaker force? How do you do that with the way that things just kind of moved about? And if this is where we start, this is where we end, and this is the inevitability of things, right? And this is just the way it was always going to play out, no matter what, which is a very interesting way to think about it, right? I probably did not do a very good job of explaining it, but it's also been such a drag reading this. It's definitely like a, you know, when are we going to get to this? We then get the burning of Moscow, and you kind of have this thing, right, of where like you have the Rostovs leaving at the very last second, even though everyone else has already left Moscow, and you kind of get to explore some themes there, which I'll go back to Sonya in a second, because Sonya's gonna get screwed over, I know it. And then you have Pierre, who stays in Moscow and then tries to hide, and ends up being arrested because he attempts to stop a French soldier from looting a poor family, right? And the reason Pierre stays is because he's going to attempt to assassinate Napoleon, and it does not go well, right? But with all this, right, you have the idea of Moscow being the last true stronghold of what does it mean to be Russian, and you know, the great symbolism of Russia and all of these things, and the abandoning of it is what is the tactically correct move, because there's no way to truly defend Moscow, but at the same time it is this great loss, because this is a great loss of personhood and culture, right? You then get what is Leo Tolstoy's perspective on it, which is the burning of Moscow, and the idea that by abandoning it, the burning of it was inevitable, right? And that you could have the idea that somehow having Moscow be controlled by the French with the Russians living in it was somehow so terrible that you must abandon it, was this wrong decision, right? And this very weird decision, because of how much of, especially the Russian aristocracy and the Russian elites, but how much Russia adopted and was like in love with France in so many ways, but then the refusal to be around the French, right, or be ruled by the French, is a very interesting thing that Tolstoy kind of tackles at a couple different points, but doesn't truly fully expand on it. But yeah. Finally, the last person to talk about, the person that I want to talk about, is Sonya. We don't see a great deal of Sonya throughout this book, but she does pop up a couple different points. Sonya is gonna get fucked over in this. There's no question in that in my head about this. The main, right, the Rostov at one point, Nikolai Rostov, the one who was initially going to marry Sonya, ends up meeting Andrei's sister Maria at one point, very, very briefly, and writes about it back to his family. And then the family is like, oh yeah, I know that things went poorly between Andrei and Natasha, but that doesn't mean that Rostov can't marry the sister and still marry Rich. Which is this very, very funny thing, but I think will in some way end up being how this works out, because Prince Andrei is presumed at this point that he is going to die, even though he's getting better at the end of book 3, but Rostov will probably not marry Sonya. He'll probably marry Maria, or I don't think he can marry Julia anymore, because I think Julia's not married to Boris. But yeah, he'll marry someone rich. And then Sonya gets constantly gets screwed throughout all of this, right? And it's through a lot of small things, right? It's through this, when the Rostov family is finally packing up to leave, everyone's useless except for Sonya, until Natasha snaps out of it and is suddenly coherent again. But Petya can't do anything really. The Countess won't do anything. The Count is giving very poor instructions, and Sonya has to follow them and attempt to give them to the best of her ability, because she has basically been put in charge of everything and packing up this massive house. And everything is it's getting done. It's just getting done very poorly, right? And so much of it just falls onto Sonya's shoulders, in terms of like, she's trying her damnedest, right? She is this 20-something-year-old that is suddenly being forced to be in charge of everything, and just kind of getting screwed out of it because she doesn't have the royal bloodline, right? She doesn't have, right? She's the adopted daughter, all right? She's not this, legitimate heir that, has power no matter what. And so, even though that she's doing so much and taking so much care and taking so much control over just getting things done, is getting screwed out of it, right? The same thing then goes for immediately afterwards with the wagons, of which it becomes this whole argument on financial things versus the people, right? And the giving up of and removing a whole bunch of things from wagons, and personal belongings and family belongings from wagons, to then give to the wounded soldiers to cart them away from Moscow, right? Good thing overall, right? And in Sonya's case, though, right, it ends up being this thing of, right, there is no money in the Rostovs anymore. She does not get to marry. She's not going to be marrying Nikolai. I can guarantee that. Nastasia will marry someone else rich. And so all these physical possessions and all of this is what little wealth and very little of it will go to Sonya, but it becomes a thing of this is what will keep Sonya safe or allow Sonya into a nice marriage in some way, is selling all these things for money. And with the war and with the price of goods, of luxury goods, and non-essential goods depleting, and the abandonment of so many of these things, right? We are seeing what will be Sonya's lifeline and Sonya's livelihood diminish and be destroyed. And then later in the chapter, or later in the book, towards the very end, it's revealed at some point to Sonya. Sonya finds, or I think it's Sonya. I think Sonya finds out that Prince Andrei is actually staying in the house that the Rostovs are in as a wounded soldier, and ends up telling Natasha. And it basically was Natasha into this, once again back into this kind of comatose state or whatever. And Sonya gets admonished for it, and it is this kind of deal of where, like, Sonya is being forced into being this caregiver and caretaker for so many people, and an attempt to support so many people, and to do the right thing. And what is constantly occurring is that every time that she does something great or something wonderful, it's what's expected of her, because she's the adopted daughter, and that's what's expected of her, is to be the best, effectively. But anytime that she does wrong is the worst thing in the world, and incredibly destructive. And even though what ends up happening, at least at the end of this, is that Natasha ends up, and Prince Andrei really make amends, and Natasha has found her will to live again, effectively, by trying her best to nurse Prince Andrei back to health. And Sonya will get nothing for that, right? Sonya will, instead of in some way being commended or being supported, and the fact that she helped reunite Sonya, or that Sonya helped reconnect Prince Andrei and Nastasia, it'll be left, and she's just gonna get screwed. And none of this is gonna end well for her, which is unfortunate, because I think Sonya is like the best character in this, and she's just gonna get screwed out of this. But anyway, that's book 3. I will probably be finishing. I might finish book 4 tomorrow. It's like 300 pages or something, 400 pages I gotta read. Otherwise, I'll be finishing it after I move.
Right, I am filming this from the floor of Midway Airport as I'm on my layover. And I have no idea how much this is going to be usable. I'm going to have to just re-record this later. But today, during the first flight, I have finished reading War and Peace. I would show you, however, it being right now used to balance this to make it a good height. Read part 4, or book 4, of the modern interpretation of books are constructed, and the epilogue. There's some things to go about talking about this, right? It's so much of the thematic explanation and the description and the overall larger discussion by Tolstoy is all about this idea of kind of free will, but the whole predeterminedness of things, right? And about how we give praise or we assume genius because things work out for certain people without necessarily that being the truth, right? That's a lot of discussion. It is on a much larger scale in a lot of ways, right? Of where it is very natural for humans to really, really want to, in a way, deify or heroify the people that are above us, right? Because if we make the rationalization that every single person is just a person, then we run into major issues with people like Napoleon, and why do we let Napoleon completely destroy or take over the vast majority of Europe, right? If he's just another person, right, we have to make him a hero. Which then also means that we have to excuse all these actions, right? Because part 4, or book 4, the first 2 parts are really about this. What becomes the massive failure of the French army into Russia in 1812 to 1813. But it becomes very confusing if we get so stuck in our heads that the people that lead us have to be heroes and have to be deities, right? Because as it goes, the French, by definition, win at Borodino, I think it is. And then they take Moscow. And then they take Moscow with no resistance. There is no battle there. And then they attempt to continue taking Russia, realize that they're not going to be able to do it, and begin retreating. And then there are no more battles, right? And then the French just lose the war. And there's skirmishes, and there's still some fighting, but it's not active fighting, right? It is the guerrilla warfare of this is a retreating army, and we were just taking pot shots at them at a couple of points. But really, what this is that you have this situation in which the losing side of a war won the last major decisive battle and captured the other's capital, and then immediately lost, right? And so you end up in this really, really strange situation with your entirety of military history and your entirety of when you think about people and culture and life, liberty, pursuit of happiness is based in and around, well, we won, so we should win the entire thing, right? And so it's, as Tolstoy was describing, there's so many caveats and so many different explanations as to why Napoleon is so great, Napoleon is so wonderful, or how, or somehow, some way, all of these retreats are Russian victories, but is the winning side, no matter what, retreating after every battle. And so it just makes no sense, right? If that's not the way that you're used to. If you're of the belief that our leaders have to be important, then that makes no sense, right? Versus what Tolstoy really kind of pushes is this inevitability of things. It is this inevitability of what's going to happen. It's this inevitability of the way that the war is going to end up, right? All of these quote-unquote tactical genius moves are moves that the most peasant would have made because they make the most sense. Right? we cannot promote genius while then also actively exploring what's actually going on. So yeah, lots of discussion on that. Within that, then there's a lot of discussion about people, and I can't remember their names, so I'm part of the problem. But like in comparison to Gustav, who like gets a lot of blame for a lot of Russia's stuff during his time as the general or commander-in-chief. Then we also have an issue of where like there are people that like Tolstoy only mentions once, and he makes a point of it that he only mentions them once during this last book. That these are like incredibly important people, and yet we don't write their names in history books. We don't sing their praises because their involvement in things or the way that they were not taking control of leadership. Right. Instead, they were not constantly forcing themselves to be named in things. Right. And they were the ones that just did the hard things. And we just give no credit to them because, while they're not the ones that were self-promoting themselves the entire time. Right. So that's that. That goes into a little bit with Pierre Nikolai in some ways, right? Nikolai, which like he refuses to mingle with the upper class at the end, right? It just doesn't interest him, and so it makes him seem like a recluse when all he is just a guy, right? See, yeah. I think that's really good for like the military. The epilogue, part 2 of the epilogue is just Tolstoy ranting about things and like further expanding on the stuff, and does it a lot better way than I ever could. It's like 60 pages of this. That's part 2 of the epilogue. But no, the actual characters, the actual what's the story kind of based around what's happening here. There are 3 major deaths that occur during part 4. And one of them we just kind of threw under the bus, and it's Ellen's death. And Ellen just kind of dies. There's this whole thing in which she's still married to Pierre, but is supposed to be able to get a divorce, and then from that she's like debating between marrying these 2 guys, and then she starts to get sick, and then ends up, they presume that she overdoses on like some sort of drug, and then Ellen just dies, right? And I think speak about that second. Then we get to Prince Andrei dying. And Prince Andrei eventually dies from his wound that he suffered in book 3, in which he has been reunited with everyone, and then in some way it has a moral death, or has an emotional death, which then leads to his overall death, right? And in some way it relates to what does Prince Andrei end up wanting out of things, right? And it is the happiness of people around him. And so in the end, right, the best thing for him to do is to die, because in theory, grant the most happiness to both Natasha and to Maria, his sister. And then finally, the last really big important death is the death of Petya. Petya I believe at the end of book 3, or maybe it's the beginning of book 4, is old enough. He enlists. He gets sent to. He's supposed to just be like a cavalry officer and like be a paperwork guy. That's all he's supposed to be doing. But he is young and he is full of life and he wants to battle. And so he inserts himself into a whole bunch of dangerous situations constantly. And then eventually it gets him killed, in which he, on a raid, as the French are retreating, he charges in beyond where he should have been and ends up getting killed because he puts himself in the front line. And, you know, it destroys everyone, right? But like all those 3 deaths, right? These are all, I would argue that what Tolstoy is trying to write here, trying to show is this gung-ho-ness and this desire, this want, right? In 3 very different ways, I would say, right? With Petya, it is this fervor and this passion just to serve and to wage war because someone higher up than you says it's okay, we need to wage war. With Andre, you kind of fall into this is the group of people that are trying to enrich themselves because of the war in some way. And then the Ellen death is the trying to profit off the death of other people, right? Or the abandonment from other people, right? Right. And all these people have been dying in very unfortunate ways. But yeah, right. It's just this whole concept of the 3 people that we spend some time with that end up profiting off them, all end up dying. Which I think there's something to be said there. Along with the war, the other person we're going to talk about is Dolokhov. Dolokhov makes his reappearance. I don't think he was in any of book 3. Dolokhov makes his reappearance, and he is the one that ends up sending Petya to his death, effectively, by encouraging Petya to be reckless and to go and fight the way he wants to fight. Right? And Dolokhov's response is nothing to it. Denisov is also there, and Denisov is incredibly upset by the entire thing. But Dolokhov, who is the one that's pretty responsible for Petya really getting involved in this, has no remorse and does not kill, and so continues to count the prisoners that Petya has captured. Right, and it's an interesting way to end Dolokhov, right? Because Dolokhov, in a lot of ways, is responsible for the downfall of the Rostovs through indirect means, right? And if you're to look at this maybe from the future, Dolokhov can be the representation for Tolstoy of the inevitability of people spending time with people that are robbing us, right? That they will destroy you in so many different ways without you ever truly realizing that you've been destroyed, right? Because all 3 Rostov children, Nikolai, what's her name? Nikolai, Natasha, and Petya all kind of suffer like major issues because of Dolokhov, right? Because Nikolai Rostov, it becomes superintendent with him through the game. Nastasia ends up with this issue of Dolokhov is the one that encourages Anatol to continue to spend time with and eventually try to elope with Natasha, and then finally you have Petya, who dies directly at the hands of Dolokhov, insisting that he be okay going to war, right? And all three of these things have been this issue of like, it is this inevitability, right? It is inevitable that these things should happen, and Dolokhov becomes a representation of the forces of what happens when you decide to, out of loyalty, spend time with people that are not, who are selfish, right? That becomes kind of what this is. So that's that. You then get the actual marriages and the actual families, right? As predicted through book three, which is another one of these inevitability things, right? Nikolai Rostov gets married to Princess Maria. Pierre ends up getting married to Natasha, which all kind of works out in the end. None of them are like the happiest people in the world, and we see kind of what their lives are like in the epilogue mostly, and they're not, right? No one's like super jazzed about everything, right? But it's just kind of where they ended up, right? And they're making my girl Sonya, so bad for her. She just ends up in this very weird situation where, like, she is still like, or for a while, was still like developable, just with no inheritance, and then like just gets screwed out of everything, right? Because of this one thing, right? And it has to do with this whole classism thing, but also this right, inability to change social places, right? Where she does all this work for free. She does everything. She is still lively, and yet can't marry because who would marry her? She has no official royal blood. She's an orphan or bitch, right? She has no claim to anything. And you know, and then she ends up living with Nikolai at the end of where, when they are poor and impoverished, all of a sudden she's still living with Nikolai and with the Countess. And then when Nikolai gets married, she then lives with Nikolai and Princess Maria, and it's like becomes like their main housekeeper, right? And it's like this tragic thing for this girl, right? Because when we then get the description of both Maria and Sasha at the end, and they are both this. They're both married, they're both happy in that way, but they also lost a lot of, or not necessarily interested in living a lot of ways, right? And then you have Sonya, who is still interested, but has been forced to, in order to survive, to be in this incredibly submissive role and be constantly living with this idea of what could have happened if only her adopted caregiver would have given a shit 10 years earlier. You know, and that's just such a terrible way. That's such a terrible ending for Sonya, especially because like so much like I would explore Sonya so much more, and we just don't. She's super important for these first for this book and a half. And then she disappears for the most part, right? And it's so sad. You're then dealing with both the marriages. There's nothing really to say for me about either of these marriages, right? They're just marriages. There's nothing super interesting there. What is interesting to me is the way that both these households end up being run, which speaks to me of it's very much focused on the Rostovs, and it's what the Rostovs say is what the Rostovs is what happens, right, in both marriages. And so like it's this thing of like the Rostovs, after getting completely embarrassed in life because of the actions of their father, and the sort of mismanagement by their father, end up in their marriages being hyper controlling, right? Whether through different means, but it's just hyper controlling, and that they have to be in control of things, and it's mostly just because, well, that's what they need, right? That's when, for both of them, right, this loss of control that they had throughout these very formative years makes them need to have that, right? But yeah, that's the end of War and Peace. Yeah, it is a monster. It is a drag at some points, right? It is fascinating at some points, but like, because it is not a novel, right? It is not a novel, there was just a series of novels. It is this incredibly unique piece of literature that has to be experienced, but like, you have to set a time to experience it, right? And like, even for me, the way that I read this book was not ideal, right? Of where it took me so much time, but then also it was this constant breaks and doing other things and coming back to it, right? And not necessarily paying, the utmost attention to it that I had. And so it ended up losing a lot for me, unfortunately. It's not how the show gone, but that's that. That is War and Peace by Tolstoy.